Welcome to Cancer Lesson 1.5. How do we determine cancer risk? The goals of this lesson are to explore how we can determine the risk that a behavior will lead to cancer, and to understand how evaluating risk can be used to assess whether or not to advise changing a behavior. At the end of the lesson, the students should be able to explain the terms survival rate, incidence rate, and age-adjusted mortality rate in the context of cancer, and explain how calculating risk factors for cancer uses population statistics, and use risk factors to make an informed decision on behavior choices. We will achieve our goals through a Socratic discussion and by engaging in an activity to calculate the risk of developing cancer, called the odds ratio. To prepare for this lesson, you'll need to review the following key scientific concepts that will be presented throughout the lesson. The concepts of incidence rate, survival rate, and mortality rate. These rates are used to track patterns of disease in populations. You will also need to review how to use the odds ratio to calculate risk. The odds ratio tells us the odds that an outcome will occur. For example, what are the odds of developing lung cancer if we smoke? In this lesson, we are using the term odds to mean risk following exposure. Fortunately, when the outcome following an exposure is rare, as it is in cancer, odds and risk mean the same thing statistically. So, calculating the odds can tell us the risk following an exposure. You will also need to review how to interpret the odds ratio. An odds ratio of 1 means the odds you will get lung cancer if you smoke is the same as the odds you would get lung cancer if you don't smoke. An odds ratio greater than 1 means the odds that you will get lung cancer if you smoke is greater than the odds of getting lung cancer if you don't smoke. And finally, an odds ratio less than 1 means the odds of getting lung cancer if you smoke is less than the odds of getting lung cancer if you don't smoke. You can review this scientific content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, and the student workbook provides additional explanation for students. Be sure to print the lesson worksheet and the homework worksheet. The key point of the Do Now is that preventing cancer through behavior change requires an understanding of how risky the behavior is. We'll get there by discussing the previous lesson's homework. In the Do Now, students should discuss what kind of evidence they would like to see that might influence their decision to avoid things like tanning beds or smoking. The key points of the discussion are the following. Evaluating risk is important when exposure to a carcinogen increases the likelihood of cancer. Risk evaluation lets us figure out how to modify behavior to prevent cancer. And the odds ratio lets us assess how much risk an exposure poses. We'll get there with a Socratic discussion. First, we review the slide from the last lesson to make the point that while it may be difficult to prove causality, it is much easier to show a correlation between an exposure and the risk of developing cancer. But unless there is a strong correlation between exposure to a carcinogen and development of cancer, people will be reluctant to change their behavior. Next, we set up the most common behaviors that increase our risk of cancer. But what if we engage in such behaviors only occasionally? It is important to realize that risk depends on how often we engage in risky behaviors. This leads us to the two major questions to ask in risk evaluation. First, how dangerous or severe is the outcome? And second, how likely is that behavior going to lead to the outcome? Notice that we are shifting now from a consideration of the impacts on the individual to the impacts on the population. To answer the first question about disease impact, we will use three epidemiological concepts: incidence rate, survival rate, and mortality rate. To answer the second question about likelihood, we turn to the odds ratio. the odds ratio calculation is more accurate to calculate the risk when incidence in a population is low. What is the odds ratio? To understand this concept, we turn to a diagram of the calculation. We start with our population. In the population, some people use tanning beds, and of these people, a few developed skin cancer. But some of the people who didn't use tanning beds also got skin cancer. The rest who didn't use tanning beds did not get skin cancer. Now that we've identified our subpopulations, we can calculate the odds ratio. Essentially, the odds ratio is a ratio of ratios. In the numerator, we have a ratio of the group that was exposed and got the disease to the group that was exposed and is healthy. In the denominator, we have a ratio of the group that was not exposed and got the disease to the group that was not exposed and is healthy. Most people use a 2x2 table to calculate the odds ratio. Now that we've calculated our odds ratio, we must interpret it. Let's say we find an odds ratio of 2. This means that being exposed to tanning beds increases the odds of developing cancer twofold compared to no exposure to tanning beds. Another way to think about this is that the probability of getting cancer is twice as high if you are exposed to tanning beds than the probability of getting cancer if you were not exposed. What if we had an odds ratio of 1? This means that being exposed to tanning beds makes no difference in our odds of developing skin cancer. What about an odds ratio of 0.5? This means that being exposed to tanning beds decreased our odds of developing skin cancer by 1/2. The key point of the activity is that the odds ratio can be used to assess the impact of different behaviors on the risk of developing cancer. We'll get there by learning how to calculate and interpret the odds ratio. The odds ratio activity can be performed as a jigsaw activity. In that case, students will work in small groups, and each group will examine data from scientific papers and calculate the odds ratio for the risk of developing cancer in each of these situations. Then they will make suggestions about which behaviors would be appropriate to change in light of these risks. Finally, they will compare their conclusions with federal policies. Students should see the highest odds ratio is between smoking and lung cancer. We wrap up the activity by discussing the fact that smoking does not just increase risk of lung cancer, but also increases the risk of many cancers. Next, have students discuss what factors can and cannot be avoided. For example, they should understand that some risk factors, such as genes or family history, cannot be avoided. For homework, have students read an information sheet on survival rates for various types of cancer and complete the questions that assess their understanding of survival rates. One of the most common questions students ask is how to interpret an odds ratio that is greater than 1. The key is fold change. For example, an odds ratio of 2 means a twofold increase in risk compared to the population that was not exposed. Another question students ask is, in the activity, why is the number of people who have cancer larger than the number of people who are healthy? This is because the study was designed to investigate a correlation between a behavior and developing cancer. So the researchers started from the point of identifying people who had developed cancer and then traced their prior behaviors. Also, generally, it is easier to identify groups with a condition than healthy controls. At the end of the lesson, collect student worksheets to assess whether students can calculate the odds ratio and use it to evaluate policies related to cancer. This lesson wraps up Unit 1 and provides the tools to critically think about behavior and lifestyle changes. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members at any time and we'll be happy to help you.